It's time, and we have third and last presentation for our seminar today. And we have Mike Loftus. He was also a speaker last year. So Mike is the object conservator at Norsk Luftfartsmuseum, or Norwegian Aviation Museum, since 2016. He is responsible for collections care, conservation treatments, and activity in the workshop. He will talk about several aircraft and exhibitions he was worked on from his time in Scotland and Norway. So Mike, please.
Okay, hi there. So the theme for today's talk is bringing aircraft or large objects to exhibition. So I do not know all about all aspects of this complex process, so I will concentrate on the areas that I do know, which is primarily moving and preparing these objects for display. I'll push the definition of large a little bit by talking about all sizes of aircraft, as all of the ancillary processes of writing interpretation, setting lighting, building furniture, display furniture, finding supporting objects. All of these processes are the same, regardless of the size of your object. Object selection is another key factor in exhibition. So we can talk a little bit, so Valeri talked a little bit about this, about the process we have adopted at Norsk Luftfartsmuseum. After all, you're making a significant investment in a large object or a new exhibition, and you must ensure that it is, you select relevant and interesting objects. I will eventually talk about our 737-300, which is now located outside the museum, how we moved it, what was involved in preparing it for its use, and the difficulty of the outdoor display environment. But we have a lot to get through first, and I will also talk about other objects and projects that I have been involved in that are relevant to the theme. As you know, I'm an objects conservator, so I follow a code of conduct which is based upon minimizing material loss from an object. Compliance to this becomes a much greater challenge with large complex objects, and especially those which are displayed outside. And at the heart of this process, of the conservation process, is what should an object look like? Do we turn the clock back and restore an aircraft to a shiny new condition or an era in its history that we were particularly fond of? Or should we concentrate on stabilizing its current condition? Your decisions about how you treat your object dictate what your audience will eventually see and how they will interpret it. And as a museum, we are duty bound to present authentic objects and must be mindful about achieving the balance to not lose an object through over restoration and to not lose interpretation by presenting objects that are difficult to interpret because they are mangled wrecks, for example. So this talk, if you can think of it as a little bit of a remix, a little bit of the best of what I have talked about in other talks. So for those of you who have heard my previous talks, I hope you enjoy some of this content a second time. And because of that, some of you will be familiar with my background. But for those of you who are not, I'll just set the scene a little bit, as this will explain my approach to treating objects. So I work at Norsk Luftfartsmuseum, and we are in fact several organizations in one. This is the military side, and this is a fairly comprehensive slice of chronology through military aviation history in Norway. And also there's a separate site, the Flysamling in Gardermoen, near Oslo, and both of these sites will be getting an F-16 soon to help bring us up to date. On the civilian side, of course, this is telling the story of civil aviation history in Norway. And also we have the Avinor collections, and Avinor are the airport operators in Norway, and we collect their history in return for funding. They collect such things, or we collect such things on their behalf: fire engines, sweepers, control tower equipment, radar, that kind of thing. Another organization which is very close to the museum is the Broeder Luftvaarthistorisk Vereniging. They are a voluntary organization, and they have been responsible for finding a lot of our objects and subsequently have a very special relationship with our collection. Because they have found them in the fields and on the mountainsides, they have recovered them. They have brought them back to Bodø, restored them, and set them on display in the museum. But before all that, a bit of background setting. Before I came to Norway, I worked at Museum Nanyellen in the Isle of Lewis, which is 35 nautical miles off the northwest coast of Scotland. And here I mainly concentrated on archaeological conservation, or the conservation of archaeological objects. So what you're looking at here on the top is Norse era brooches. These are missing jewels and missing securing pins at the back. But just as a reference, I would never consider taking jewels or pins from another one to make these whole. And on the bottom, what you see is a dagger from the notorious Ireland serial killer Machintronic. And what had happened here, because it had been buried, the organic elements, the leather of the sheath and the handle had become mineralized. So this object required stabilization to stop the flaking, which you can see in the picture. Next up is an Iron Age pot. What was wrong with this is it had a lot of flaking loose material and cracking, which again had to be stabilized. And after this, I toned it in with earth pigments to just tone in the work that I had done. If this pot had had missing sections, I would not take a fragment from another to make it whole. Maybe you have seen examples in other museums where a fill has been made to a pot, but it will have been left white. So it's to distinguish the new from the old. The argument I hear a lot is that with aircraft, they are a production line object. They are one of many. They would always have parts replaced through service. But now my counter argument is they are museum objects, and I see them the same as the pot or the dagger. Any loss has to be avoided if necessary. Any subtraction or addition with non-original parts dilutes your object and damages its ability to tell you specifically about the life it had. So back to aircraft. In a previous life, I worked in the Museum of Flight, which was part of the National Museum Scotland estate at East Fortune. So this is the best preserved World War II airfield in Britain and possibly one of the best in Europe. So we had 4 large hangars full of aircraft and other outlying buildings with other exhibitions. And again, this collection is split over civil and military collections. So left there, obviously, a Concorde and a very nice looking Tornado in good original condition on the right. One of the principal objects I worked on whilst at the Museum of Flight was bringing the forward fuselage of a 707 to exhibition. And here is the aircraft in its prime. This aircraft flew for BOAC from 1960 to 1981. Subsequently displayed outside at RAF Cosford as part of the British Airways collection until 2006. Displayed over grass, not so good. After 25 years, it had suffered a lot of the associated problems of outdoor life. We have quite severe exfoliation to the skin, and we have some very tired interiors. You can see some of the vinyl of the seats beginning to peel off, and it didn't smell so good either. After a structural assessment, it was not considered viable to save this aircraft as a whole, and plus the challenge of moving it from the middle of England to Scotland. The consequence was sectioning of the aircraft, with only the forward fuselage being saved. As time wears on, many more historic aircraft will face this fate, but needless to say, there are many who are critical of such decisions. But it can be argued that saving what you can is better than nothing at all. What happened next is this aircraft was sent off for a repaint to better fit the story or the era in which the curatorial staff wanted to talk about in the exhibition. So here it is on return. It now has a new handling and display frame. It's a heavy object, so it had to be lifted with a crane. And here we are fitting the frame underneath it, which would raise it to the original height of the fuselage, as if it were a complete aircraft. So then came the work on the interior. It was complete interior strip out pretty much. The floor had become rotten, so the original aluminium floor was rotten, had been replaced in part by wood, which had also become rotten. So we restored what we could with, and then with the rest was replaced with aerolam. You can see the new aerolam at the middle there, and the rest was what we managed to save. The seats themselves and the overhead lockers were kind of Frankensteins. These were made from from the components of many that we had taken from the rest of the fuselage, which we did not save. The seats were recovered to match the era of the paint on the outside. And in retrospect, this approach was questionable as it resulted in great unnecessary material loss, i.e. the paint on the outside of the aircraft and the in-service original seat covers. People have to get in and out of it. A permanent access there was made, and although not a aircraft stairs, it had a big platform at the top, which actually helps people getting in and out, and you don't result in sort of bottlenecks. So it's actually quite a good structure. And here was the finished product. So on the left-hand side was an interactive exhibition talking about aircraft structure and the history of the airliner. And on the right-hand side was a mock-up of how it would have looked in service, but made from original parts of that actual aircraft. So you can see there was quite a lot involved in bringing an object like this to exhibition. And I have not spoken about the building of the interactive exhibits. I have not spoken about the lighting. I've not spoken about the writing of the interpretation, or indeed the small object selection which complements this aircraft. So this was a good example to illustrate the difficulty of presenting a large and degraded object. And did the restoration go too far? Was there too much material lost to serve turning of the clock back, i.e. the paint and the seat covers? And could this story have been told in with the object in its found condition? Well, ultimately it probably could, but I can see the attraction to having something not looking in such poor condition. There was also a problem with use, so the public were invited to access the aircraft. I think there was a little bit of over access. There was continual damage to the seats through heavy use as people sat on them, and people behave very differently on an aircraft that their life does not depend on. So many of these seats had their substructures broken, and the metal substructure bits were snapped and brought beyond repair. So bringing something to exhibition is not a one-off effort, especially if you are going to display it outside. You must maintain it and keep it going, and eventually this is going to result in a large intervention, a big effort. There is frequently criticism of how can museums let their outdoor displays degrade so much, but the answer is simple. They're large, complex objects, and as a museum, you just don't have the resource to match this. But here is the story of a Comet 4C, which is on display at East Fortune to this day. It was one of the last to see service. It was initially built for RAF Transport Command. It was retired by the RAF in 1975 and sold to Dan Air, who in turn retired it in 1980, and was the last Comet to fly in commercial colours when she flew into the museum at East Fortune in September of 1981. So this aircraft was a very popular exhibit due to the level of access afforded to the public, who were free to walk through the passenger cabin. So this facilitates in great direct primary interpretation. People literally can get their hands on it. And the interior was largely unaltered since service. But the time had come for a maintenance catch-up. You can see on the outside here there was ingrained dirt to the skin. The usual stories here now of exfoliation to the skin, moss growing on the fuselage. The fire escapes are castings and very prone to filiform corrosion. You can see quite heavy moss growth around one of the windows there. And this resulted in a lot of water ingress, which had caused mold. And you can see a big problem here with corrosion to the seat rails. The floor structure had also began to give way. So this is the substructure underneath the floor on the left-hand side. This is just through 20 years of use, people walking up and down it has popped its rivets. And on the right-hand side there, you can see in the air circulation system, we had more mold. We had the mold tested and it came back as penicillin, which was amazing because apparently it was hard to culture enough of this stuff when they first started using it. But we had no problem. Another problem the aircraft had, it was left unattended for most of the time and people were reliving the glory days of smoking on aircraft. So not so good. So what did we do? Well, of course, we emptied the ashtrays. We stripped out the interior, so seats and carpet out. We vacuumed everything. We used isopropanol alcohol to wipe down absolutely everything to kill the mold. We removed the fire escapes. And as you can see here on one of the fire escapes, there was a previous attempt at the use of a silicon sealant on the bottom of the aperture here. And this had actually accelerated the corrosion of this casting. So whilst the doors were not in the aircraft, we made these temporary covers out of Irish linen to keep the weather out. So then back in the workshop, we ground back all of the corrosion and the areas of loss were built back up and then sanded back for a nice smooth surface. The seal which used to keep the weather out was too far gone and this could not be renovated and reused. So this would go around the edge of the fire escape like so. So in the end, what we did, we replaced all of this with plastic rubber compound. And PR compounds are fantastic. They are an elastomized epoxy resin. And when it's dry, you can tie knots in this stuff. It's really quite an amazing bit of technology. The window seals were similarly gone, and the treatment of these was similar. We also used PR compound. PR compound, when it is in its liquid state, is very, very gooey and can be quite difficult to work with. So you have to mask off everything because removal of it afterwards is very difficult. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the fire escape ready for going back in the aircraft. We had to take off several windows at a time, exposing the interior of the aircraft to the weather. So we had to come up with a solution to weather seal it. And luckily for us, one of our volunteers, John, had worked in the nuclear industry where he told us about the use of space hoppers to jam windows and pipe ends. So we transferred this from nuclear industry to the museum. Worked very well. Next is the finished product, which I think is passable. It doesn't look quite the same as it did originally, but it did keep the water out and it did look okay. Next, now we had weather sealed it, came the rebuilding of the floor. It was too time costly to rebuild the floor panels, to drill out all the rivets, make bridging pieces for the supports and put it all back in again. So we opted for the use of ISoAMEP. The ISoAMEP is a different thickness to the original floor, so packers were bonded onto the back of it to raise it up to the correct level. The interior was reinstated, and here it is, sort of the finished product. So a quick note concerning the materials used in this restoration, in this treatment. ISoAMEP and plastic rubber were not invented at the time of the manufacture of this aircraft. And the use in this aircraft, it does dilute the authenticity of it. It is no longer what it used to be. Used materials that would never have been there. Why did we do it? Well, we did it because of convenience and longevity. In conservation, you should only ever use an approved material, ones that are proven to be stable over long periods of time. And you avoid issues like the use of the silicon sealant we saw before, which would break down into acetic acids, which would indeed accelerate corrosion. So you need to avoid things like that happening. There's lots of good data from the aviation industry about plastic rubber. There are some which is specifically formulated to be in contact next to acrylic glazing, so it doesn't craze it. Others which are fuel resistant to seal fuel tanks. and so on. So there are many different types formulated very specifically for the uses intended. Work has continued on this aircraft since I left, and apparently a lot of work has been done to the exterior. So maybe my colleague Thilo can come to the conference someday and tell you all about how they continued the work. So since I started working at Norsk Luftfartsmuseum, we have been very busy producing exhibitions and collecting objects. I first came to Norsk Luftfartsmuseum in 2016, where they were halfway through the major reconstruction of the civil aviation exhibition, V-Flair. So here is a snapshot of the old exhibition, which was considered to have become tired and confused by the slow erosion of addition, a little bit here and a little bit there. So what is involved in making a new exhibition? Well, first you need to do some visioning. And this was done in collaboration with Freeman Ryan Design, a design firm based in Australia. And it started with a thematic diagram and sketches of how it would look. The central theme of this exhibition is how aviation was really at the heart and the core of the modernization of Norway, how it helped overcome the geography, and it helped really bring the nation together. I mean, obviously connecting them in a way that they had not been connected before. So after this concept comes the practical planning. So you have all of your aircraft, you selected them, and you need to make sure they're all going to fit and where they will go. And then as we were going to suspend some of our aircraft, you need to make sure you know your building. So load calculations need to be done on the roof beams. We are a purpose-built aviation museum, and the beams were designed to take load. But of course, you have to be very careful not to overload. More engineering follows this in the form of the rigging design, where we brought in a firm, Unusual Rigging, who are responsible. Anything unusual that needs to be suspended around the world, Unusual Rigging are usually the people who will come and do it. They have enormous amounts of experience of this sort of thing. So what you're looking at here is details from the Cessna 337 that we were going to suspend. Top left, you can see the points of the aircraft where the rigging was going to attach. On the right hand side, you can see the new wing bolts which were going to be required. Very often you will use the wing bolts to suspend an aircraft, but you will need to manufacture new ones which are specifically designed to take the loads in those particular way. So the old bolts are removed by knocking in new ones, kind of like a reverse guide pin. So just to make sure you have no mishaps, here we are supporting the wing just in case anything happened. Here it is in process. So top right, you can see the new shackle waiting. Bottom left, you can see both of them there, fore and aft. And we had manufactured new wing fillets, so we didn't have to put holes in any original parts of the aircraft. Then you are ready to raise it. So we brought in this guy Helge and a crane truck, and he picked up the aircraft and very delicately and precisely maneuvered them into place. And there you see bottom right, the finished product, the aircraft suspended. It was a similar process for the Twin Otter, but with a few additions. So this is a heavy aircraft, so must be spread over a couple of the beams. And on the right-hand side, you can see a design of a compression beam. Top left shows how it attached to the aircraft and the building. And then on the bottom there, you can see the new wing bolts. Here is a photograph of the rigging being set. You can see the compression beam there before it was hoisted up into position. Then the crane operator raises the aircraft and Unusual Rigging connect everything up before it is relaxed onto its rigging. So once you've done this, you're locked in now to maintaining this system. And every year we send up a boy to get his hands on every single nut and bolt and make sure there has been no movement. So it's very expensive doing all of this, and the question is, can you do this yourself? Do you really need to bring in all of this expensive outside competence? But for your insurers, you absolutely do. And if you look at the rigging here, this is length adjustable rigging, which unusual rigging we're able to specifically tailor on site. And this is really beyond what you should be doing unless you are doing it every day. So in the midst of all this, we were also running the conservation and restoration of our Islander. This aircraft was manufactured in 1975 and flew primarily for Norway until a heavy landing in Båtsfjord took it out of service in 1983. It spent time in storage in the museum at Sula until it came to Bodø in 2013. But by this time, it was missing many of its parts and had accumulated damage from the crash and a few knocks and dents from lying around in storage. So the philosophy was to fix damage from incidents, but not the crash damage, and keep as much original as we could, including the paint. So the dent you're looking at now was not crash damage. So the panel was removed, and that was revealed heavy damage to the primary structure. So this also needed to be repaired with new structure. So here you see a before and after, and you can see that the panel that was replaced was toned in to match the rest of the aircraft. Next up was the wings, and this had spent time as decoration in a pizza restaurant and accumulated a thick layer of grease and fat. And also at this point noticed the missing nacelle from crash damage. It was cleaned with detergents, and then contrary to our philosophy of not repairing crash damage, we repaired the crash damage. And here is Ivan, one of our volunteers, who was expertly rebuilding the missing nacelle out of reference to the damaged parts in the existing nacelle with no construction drawings. And the reason why we did this is it is integral to having the undercarriage on. No nacelle, no undercarriage. But I'll come back to this in a bit. So now it's time for assembly. And before we took it over to the museum, actually, we restored the paint using polishing compounds, and it got rid of the sort of chalky matte appearance of it. And not repainting this aircraft meant we were able to keep a lot of the record of its history. So a lot of the dents and paint chips, which had been caused by ice flying off the propeller, for example, these great signs of use that are specific to the environment in which it was used. So here we are ready to install it. Some double forklift action to set the one-piece wing on top, the world's longest socket extension required to put the undercarriage on, and of course many, many pallets to hold it in place as we eventually pieced it all together. Here it is finished back on its wheels, and it is pushed into place, exhibition furniture built around it and lighting set. So just a small note on, was it the right thing to do to rebuild the nacelle in the way that we did? In retrospect, I think that the areas that were new could have been painted in a grayscale rather than color matched. Your eye would have still seen a complete aircraft, but it would have been obvious what we had done for new. But maybe I can apply this to the next project. I can see how presenting a crashed aircraft would be damaging to the story that we were trying to tell. So aircraft are just the tip of the iceberg, and there are frequently smaller objects which you need to help complete the story that you're trying to tell. And this requires the purchasing of display cases, mannequins, plinths. All of this stuff should be conservation grade, pH neutral, and again is very expensive and time consuming. But an exhibition is never really done, and there will always be development opportunities. However, you must be careful how you go about this, as a new exhibition is a big investment, and the motivation is often that your old exhibition had become chaotic as bits have been added through the years, diluting your original theme. So what you pay for in a new permanent exhibition is a cohesive, well thought out thematic journey that makes the most of your objects. So how do you avoid degradation, and how do you avoid the onset of chaos? Well, since the completion of VFLIR, we have continued to collect. The design of the exhibition was in knowledge that we would collect and display a Sea King, and indeed a space has been left for it. But what we did not know about was the possibility of collecting the police helicopter. This was the first helicopter owned by the Norwegian police. There were others rented or third-party operated before, but this was the first one to be owned by the Justice Department. It came into service in Norway in 2004 and was retired in 2019, having been involved in countless operations. Of course, it became controversial at the times of the attack in Utøya, as it was grounded for budget restraint reasons. This aircraft was a gift and from the Justice Department, and here you can see it was flying into Bodø airworthy, but nothing ever comes for free. And there is a cost recovery exercise as asked for by the Justice Department. So parts were to be removed, the engine and the gearbox. So part of that decommissioning process, a last hop must be performed. And here it is, just so the systems, so the flight engineer can record that the systems were operational. So a firm called Aeroservice were appointed by the police to recover the engine and the gearbox. Here is Mads from Aeroservice removing the rotors for road transport back to the south of Norway. The police insisted that the aircraft was covered so that the logo could not be seen. They wanted to avoid any media coverage of police helicopter seen out of service being transported by road. But it is difficult to do these things in a clandestine way when you're out in the open. And somebody saw us and we were in the newspapers. So you can't always be in control of all of your information. But here is the aircraft on its return. No engine, with a new old gearbox and new spent rotors. But what we later discovered was further missing parts that had been taken without permission. You can see there's a few blanks there in the cockpit, and the shaft connecting the tail rotor is also missing. So we have an ongoing dispute with Aeroservice, which the police are helping us with. So to help plan out what we were going to do with this, we consulted again with FRD. So this is how we hope to avoid chaos, who helped plot out where it would go, how we would get it into museum, and where it could go in relation to the Sea King. And in this sketch here, you can see at the bottom the outline of the Sea King. And when this comes in a year's time, we will suspend the police helicopter above it. So this sketch really revealed that what we were missing was detailed, accurate measurements of our exhibition hall. So we found out that there was errors. Stairs weren't where they should be. The corners of walls weren't where they should be. And we had no record at all for our 3D points, like the height of the tail of our Junkers 52, for example. So what we really need is a good 3D scan of this to help fill in all the gaps. But what we have now, the helicopter has come in to the exhibition hall, and here we are reassembling it. And for the next year, we have a temporary exhibition in the space where the Sea King will go. We have a lectern here with some interpretation. And at the top, we have film taken from the helicopter's service life, which tell the story of some of the stuff it was involved in. So maybe in a future talk, I can come back and tell you how we've got on with the Sea King. So some of you may well have heard my talk last year on our Messerschmitt 109 G2. So what follows now is a brief recap, as it is a very relevant subject of what is involved in bringing an object like this to an exhibition. Well, this project started well before I joined the museum. I didn't direct the work to this aircraft, but when I did join the museum, I enabled its delivery to exhibition. So to cut a long story short, it was manufactured in 1942, crashed a little over a year later in a training incident where the pilot Gunther Seraphim survived and was rescued by a local family. Sadly, Gunther did not survive the war, losing his life towards the end of the conflict back in the defense of Germany. But around 2009 in Risvar, northern Norway, it was found in the field, nose down in the mud. There was a recovery operation. The object was raised, looking surprisingly good and like an aircraft. However, the condition was poor, and a decision was made to conduct a full restoration. And here is the cockpit section. There are many players involved in the restoration of this aircraft. One of the main guys was Karl Bergsack, who has he's dead now, had a restoration hangar in Hungary. And here is an example of his work. So here is the rudder and fin assembly before and after. This was paid for mainly as well by the trading in parts. So there was very little actual money involved, which is quite a remarkable story in itself. Back in Buda, the workshop here, we were folding out some of the original parts to be used as templates to rebuild new. And there are many original parts to this aircraft, but there was also a lot of new parts put in. Here is the aft fuselage section, which was made new from a workshop in Germany. Then came the story of piecing it all together and considering it was a crashed aircraft and has been refabricated from many different workshops across Europe. It pieced together very nicely. Here is a snapshot of the wings as they came back from restoration in Hungary, but the skin to these wings is much thicker than it is on the fuselage, and almost all of this is original. Here is Kjetil Lund, one of our volunteers, squeezing himself into the aft fuselage. The attention to detail was very good. All of the electrical, hydraulics, navigation, communication systems have been put back in. Yeah, say the level of detail and is very, very good. And then came the engine. So the engine here was sent to a bunch of policemen in Mo i Rana who had experience of doing this sort of thing. They had a motor club and had volunteered to take on this job. Then became a test assembly. We had all of the parts together. So obviously it's a good idea to make sure it all fits before you take it to an exhibition and have a nasty surprise. And attention to some of the other areas of detail continued. On the left here is a objects conservator, Andrea, staff member with a steady hand, doing some of the lettering to the auxiliary belly fuel tank. And here is Kjetil Lund again on the right, who is an ex-military surgeon doing fine stitching work to the linen. Then painting the aircraft. We were lucky the military had said they would paint it for free. So we took it to Baudelaire where they had a paint workshop. And here's Andrea again doing some of the detailed work on the right. I'd also at this point like you to note the camouflage. I would like you to note the size, the color, and how diffuse or not the spots are. This caused much controversy on the internet. Many comments on Facebook of people saying we'd never have looked like that. But how do they actually know? The evidence is pretty scant. So the best evidence is always your object, is always the original object. But by this time, there was not much left of the original skin and the paintwork. So it became evident that what was left was of great importance. So I conducted a mini project to any of the bits of the original that had original paint left. I consolidated it so we wouldn't lose any more, and we analysed it. We took cross sections of the paints to try and determine colour and number of layers. Next up came work to the propeller. So the idea was this. The original idea was it was to be stripped down and the hub was to be used with new blades and put on the aircraft. So work was started at the quayside and one blade was rotated in an attempt to disassemble it. But the work was abandoned on this and a new plan was hatched to get a hub from elsewhere. So the job came to me to rotate this propeller back again, because the propeller was to be used as a standalone object. So an original piece of the aircraft that could really tell you about the impact that took this object out of service. So several homemade tools were fabricated, bent and broken. I tried hanging concrete weights off it, but none of this worked, until eventually I asked a local firm to produce an enormous spanner, and we clamped this thing in the press and just hit it round until it sat in the correct position again. So now we'd done this, we needed a display mount for it. So we made one out of MDF, and then we covered that with this vinyl covering with a print of a sea floor, and you will understand why in a minute. So then came to assemble the aircraft in the exhibition gallery. We were well prepared. We knew all the components were going to fit. And then comes other ancillary parts of the exhibition. So you can see somebody in the background. Our curatorial staff have been writing all of the interpretation. They have been editing the videos. And here is our colleague Morten, who was setting the lights on the aircraft. Also, a viewing gallery had been constructed so you could see it from above, and an integrated display case to showcase the conserved elements. That was the piece that you saw before that I was consolidating the paint on. And then outside, this is the entrance hall, where you can see the propeller on the left with a projection of the wreck projected on top of it. So this was only ever envisaged as a temporary exhibition, and the aircraft was to be displayed on its own, not in the company of other fighters, where it could enjoy a different context, undiluted. And instead of the usual military supporting objects, it was displayed alongside objects like this, which talk about the impact and aftermath of a visit of such an aircraft. So now this exhibition is over, and the aircraft is on the move again to its permanent place over in the military hall, where it will be in the company of old friends again. And here you see the Spitfire just at the top of the picture there. So this display is now complete, and we won't be moving it again. So on the previous talk about the Spitfire, sorry, about the about the 109, I went into a lot of detail about the pros and cons of conservation or restoration, but I won't go into any more of that right now. So now a bit of a side note concerning dangerous materials. When you're doing restorations, you must expect hazardous materials to pop up. And if you don't budget for the treatment of them, you'll have a nasty surprise. And if your project cannot proceed safely, they have to stop. So we have a moral obligation not to expose staff or volunteers or the public to radiation and asbestos. So what you're looking at here, dials on the left, switches on the right. Stuff behind glass is okay. You have to stand in front of an object like this for a very long time for your absorbed dose to become a problem. But what is not okay is when there is no glass. And you can see on the switches on the right, there's radium paint applied directly to these switches. But you can also see there's a lot of the paint has fallen off. So it does beg the question, where is it? Is it in the box where you pick them out from? Is it on your hands? Where is it? So radium paint becomes a real problem if it is ingested in any way, inhaled or ingested. And radium has been called a bone seeker because it sits in your bone marrow. It combines with your bone marrow, giving you terrible, incurable cancers. So anybody who is a bit lighthearted with their attitude towards radiation, I think needs to think again. And anything which is open source like this, you really do need to take safety measures. Another thing that you're going to come up against is asbestos. Here is the front end of an Arado 66. Very often with a wrecked aircraft, its insides are out. And you can see here, this is an asbestos textile, which obviously needs treatments before this object is moved or worked on. We've been trying to get ahead of the game. So This is what a well-conducted asbestos removal job looks like. You want to have nice, strong airflow, and all this was because of a small asbestos textile in between this wing strut and the fuselage. We were taking this aircraft apart, so this needed to be removed in the controlled conditions. And we are now conducting a project where we're going through our stores and we are locating and treating asbestos in a controlled way, so that it does not become a problem with objects which are taken into the workshop. So now finally, a little bit about our 737-300, which is now outside the museum. So it flew into Buda in the paint scheme that you can see on the left in this in the white, but there was a lot of pressure to change it to this more favored paint scheme on the right. But as an objects conservator, I am very opposed to this, and I would rather conserve the paint scheme that it last flew in, as it is equally historically valid. And also, we just don't have the resources to expertly paint an airliner. So as mentioned before, objects like this represent a significant investment, and you need to be sure you've got the right one. So just for reference, here is a significance grid. This is taken from the Collections Trust in the UK. We have adapted this to our needs, translated it into Norwegian, and my colleague Nina has been doing most of the heavy lifting with our policies and procedures. And all of this stuff is based upon internationally accepted concepts. The form will invite you to consider provenance, who exactly it is important to, its completeness, its condition, its usability, the cost required to bring it to exhibition, its conservation requirements, and so on. But back to the business of the aircraft. This aircraft first flew in 1989, spending time in Portugal, Brazil, and Romania, and in 2006 becoming the first aircraft to be owned by Norwegian. They retired it in 2015 when it flew into Buda for the last time in this paint scheme and transferred to museum ownership. There's a usual cost recovery exercise. You can see that the engines have been removed, as has the APU, but everything else is left intact. All the navigational, hydraulic, and electrical systems are operable. The aircraft was securely stored at a military base 1.4 kilometers away from the museum whilst we decided how to display it. But this became controversial, and we found ourselves in the newspapers again, where V-Men had said how scandalous we were to hide away a multi-million krona gift. But we had not been sleeping. We had been thinking about what we were going to do with it, and we were visioning again. So here we are playing around with where we would put it. Would we put it close to the Aviation collections? Would it be next to the Newton Flight Academy, where we have lots of simulators? Or would we put it in our park area on the other side of the museum? So now, after this comes the concrete planning phase, where engineers tell you what roads you need to build, the lay of the land, how strong your concrete foundation needs to be, and so on. So now we're nearly ready to move. Here is the red line you see is the procession of the aircraft, the route it must take. All of this is in a secure military area until number 6 here. All of these green ovals represent an obstacle, whether that be a tree or a fence, a road which is not wide enough, or a weak drainage ditch which needs strengthening. And luckily for us, the military did all of this work for us. They removed all the fences, cut the trees down, built the roads, strengthened the ditches, and needless to say, we could not have done it without that work done for free. So now, almost ready, but of course you need a place to put it. And here is Consto, who built the display platform for us. But not for free, of course. So now we are ready to move it. Aviation, the guys responsible for moving 737s around the airport in Buda, they turned up with the correct equipment from which to move the aircraft. And in preparation for this, I removed the apex bolt from the torque knuckle at the front to help us get round those tight corners. And then away we went over some of these rough roads. And what you see here is the aircraft being reversed onto the platform. On the right-hand side is a temporary road, which is now being removed, made out of concrete slabs. And on the left is a road which we have kept, and this will be an access maintenance road, so we can drive vehicles and lifts and that kind of thing to the aircraft. And here it is in its final position. There it is. So why would you do all this? Why are we doing all of this? Well, it gives us good educational opportunities. It gives people good access to areas of the aircraft they would never have seen before, like the undercarriage bays and indeed the oxygen system in the overhead compartments there. And also FLIFAG, which is a technical school which is attached to the museum, will use the aircraft for teaching, as we have ground power to the aircraft. We have a hybrid cockpit there, as you can see, with lots of analog and digital systems mixed in. So what is involved in preparing this aircraft for this use? Well, all of the oxygen in the overhead compartments. This is not fed with one big head tank. They have individual canisters with a chemical accelerant, and when you pull the pin, the chemical accelerant forces the oxygen out, and they become too hot to hold. So what you don't want is oxygen leaks in the future, where you are going to invite the public into this confined area. So we've charged all of these down and put them back in again. Similarly, the emergency slides, you don't want one of these going off with the public around. So we have disarmed them with the help here of the apprentice program from the museum, RAF Cosford. There are other pressure vessels throughout the aircraft. Here is one in the undercarriage bay reading 7 bar. So this is also being charged down. So you can't run the original, even though we have ground power, we can't run the original systems. It's just going to be too expensive. So I have a temporary solution for the humidity control. Removed a window, replaced it with a sheet of aluminium, and this is a good but fairly standard dehumidifier, which is successfully holding the passenger cabin at 55%. Obviously, it can't stay there when it's open to the public, so I will move it to the luggage hold. And here in the luggage hold is where you find the mixed manifold and the recirculation fan. And these are responsible for pushing the air around the aircraft down all of the pipes which go through the aircraft. So what I will be doing with that equipment is I have removed the recirculation fan, which runs off 115 volt, 400 hertz, 3-phase electricity, and I will be replacing this with a 240 volt device. This is the filter box here, and I will be feeding my dehumidified air into this filter box. So this represents the start and the end of this circulation system. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a good cost-effective way of doing it. And maybe I need another dehumidifier. I will modify and monitor as necessary. So what comes next? You need to secure your aircraft, so you don't want it blowing around or rolling off. So here is an example of a on the right-hand side of a large aircraft in RAF Cosford. They've used large concrete blocks, steel plates and bolts, turnbuckles and a screw jack permanently under the axle. So I thought that looks like a good idea. I'll go and do the same. So I've started planning this out, doing little sketches. Where can I put it? So why do you need to do this? Why can't it sit on your tires? Well, obviously they degrade, especially in UV. So here's a picture of our tire from the 737. So eventually, if you're trying to maintain the pressure in this, it's going to pop, and you don't want to be standing next to it when it does. So what does the manual tell you to do in the event of a storm? Well, surprisingly little. The flyaway kit for a 737 is very modest. There's a bar which goes through the undercarriage, the nose axle, and to a few tie down points on the ground. You fully fuel it to add weight, and you put weight in the forward cargo hold, and that's it. Oh, chocks, of course, and that's it. That's all they tell you to do. So with this in mind, I'm kind of going to change my plan of what I'm going to do. So for now, just to secure the aircraft, we have these concrete blocks at the front. We followed the instruction with the flyaway kit. It's all about control of the nose because we don't have engines, so the center of gravity is a little bit further back. All of the force of the wind on the stabilizer makes the nose light. So if you make the nose heavy, you're going to be okay. So temporarily concrete blocks at the front, massive chocks on the mains. So what my plan is, I'm going to be removing the wheels. I'm going to send them away to be foam filled so they're solid. And when they come back, I'll be using permanent chocks, which will be bolted to the floor. The concrete blocks will be replaced with steel, which will be bolted to the floor as well. And I will put 3 tons of weight in the forward cargo hold. So I've started actioning this plan. Obviously, removing a wheel can be dangerous because of the pressure in the tire. So we have the written procedure for this, which you have to follow. Don't do what it says on the left here because it is a split hub assembly. So if there's any damage to your wheel, you have to be sure you've completely depressurized before you start doing this procedure, but it's actually quite easy to take the wheel off. So you need a jack. I've gone for a few generations of jack trying to do this. This hydraulic one is an internal leak in it, so it didn't do it. I have this pneumatic jack here, which is doing it. So it will lift the aircraft, but to do that, you need to turn up with a trailer full of stuff. So this fairly simple procedure is still quite long-winded. You need a lot of kit and a few people to do it, but it has been successful. We have managed to jack the aircraft. But the problem is it doesn't stay up there for long. There's a leak in this jack too, so it sinks quite readily. So you have to work very quickly. I can see I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to rush through the last few bits. So I have managed to did a test removal of one of the wheels. This reveals the brake rotors. And the problem is now the controversy of, do you set the brakes before you take the wheel off? If you don't set the brakes when you take the wheel off, the brake rotors slump, making it difficult to get the wheel back on. But if you do set the brake rotors, when you take the wheel off, if it goes to Oslo for foam filling, by the time it comes back, there will be slow leaks in the hydraulics and this thing will have slumped. You have to unset the brakes, reset the brakes, put the wheels on. So anyway, what I'm going to do is not set the brakes and then manipulate the brake rotors one by one to get the wheel back on. I've managed to do this, but it does take a long time. As mentioned before, we need engines, which will help bring the center of gravity forward. I have an engine. I have most of one engine. So my next project in the workshop is to build this and fit it. I will put a dummy weight in the other nacelle until I'm able to collect another engine. Again, the RAF Cosford apprentice program have helped us start building that up. Security. So at the minute we have a temporary fence around the aircraft, but this will obviously have to go. It doesn't look very good, but then you are exposed to people helping themselves to all of the hatches. And I'm probably going to have to put plates over these with padlocks, and it's going to be a bit ugly, but I don't really know what else I can do about that. I've looked at the manual about how I can disable the locks, but most of them have to be dismantled from the back, which is no good for the luggage hold, because if you lock it from the back, then you're trapped in. Usual story of what's going to be wrong with it. So we have the buildup of some organic matter already, but this is obviously very easy to remove as long as you don't allow it to build up. There is some exfoliating corrosion already, exacerbated by leaking hydraulic oil, which is not corrosive in itself, but when mixed with impurities, it attracts dirt and water, which then becomes corrosive. There's very poor paint adhesion. It's possible they just didn't use any primer here because it adds weight, and they would obviously repaint it on a regular basis. So on the left here, you can see I've started to repair the paint damage. On the right, looks okay from a distance, but up close, I'm not so happy with it. Cleaning the aircraft. When it was over in the airbase, we used to have the fire service come and give it a wash down for us, but now they can't get there. So now our procedure looks a bit more like this. Bit more labor intensive. So we're going to let people in the aircraft, and they're going to misbehave, and they're going to do things you don't like. They're going to rip bits, tear bits, but you're going to have to accept it because you have to use your aircraft. This aircraft, I think, will have a lifespan of 20 to 25 years before you start thinking you're going to have to scrap it or keep the forward fuselage or something like that, like our 707. So now you have to think about, how do people get on and off the aircraft? Well, the original idea was to have a bridge from the museum to the aircraft, obviously expensive, time consuming. I will have a temporary solution. I've collected these stairs from the airport. These were frequently used with our aircraft as it visited Bodø, but they are in themselves a large object in end-of-life condition, which needs to be brought to the workshop for a once-over. And then there's all the other stuff you need to think about. Will we have a 707 style exhibition inside it? You will need 240-volt electricity in the aircraft. You will need internet connection. You'll need lighting outside. You'll need interpretation boards. So all of these things we are yet to do. And then it's, how does this connect to the rest of your collection and the rest of your exhibition and what's going on inside the museum? Well, it connects to the museum through this object. This is the last aircraft I'll talk about. So this is the first electric aircraft in Norway, and it will be being used as a centerpiece to the new interactive exhibition Blipilot. Most people become civilian pilots by spending a lot of time in a training aircraft like this, whether it be electric or fossil fuel run. We got this aircraft because there was an incident. It had a crash. It is operated by Aviation, and they have now donated this one to the museum, bought themselves a new one. But before they donated it to us, they sent it back to the manufacturer to be overhauled. So there's no real sign of the crash damage anymore. But here we are giving it a test build in our workshop. Here we are back to visioning of Blipilot. So here that you can see that it will be a part of this interactive exhibition where people will be invited to sit in it. And then there are other interactive exhibits which will be dotted around the aircraft. So you can see that we've done a lot of work to bring the 737 to exhibition, and we have done a lot of work in Blipilot. We have now visioned it, planned it. There will be supporting objects. This is test equipment for reactions and that kind of thing. So there will be objects also around the Pipistrel electric aircraft. This was last Tuesday. We have lifted the aircraft and put it on its exhibition stand, and now the rest of the build of this will continue. And we hope to open this exhibition in mid-December. So you can see that we've done quite a lot recently, and we've been very busy. So what we really need to do is relax every now and again. And lucky for us, we are up here in Norway. We're very spoiled by this landscape. So whenever it gets a little bit too much, we can run off to the mountains. So anyway, there you go. I think I'm bang on an hour there. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike. This was what I expected to hear from you. A very detailed presentation on exhibition building and then restoration things and so on. You mentioned you had a lot of cooperation with Gosford.
Yes.
Gosford. What can you tell about other or some details how it works? The cooperation works with them, or maybe other authorities like they are?
Yeah, absolutely. They have an award-winning apprenticeship program where they take I don't know, maybe 4 to 6 apprentices every 2 years, I think it is, and they put them through a program where they learn aviation skills, but in a heritage context. They go to night class and they learn a lot of the engineering need to allow them to work on live aircraft. And many of their apprentices do go on to work on live aircraft or car restoration, for example. And part of that program, they have work placements. And we're lucky enough to be one of their destinations where they like to send their apprentices. So I make sure that I've got good, proper work for them to do when they turn up. to give them a good experience. And we get a lot of work out of them. So I'm very happy with the relationship that we've managed to build up with Cosford. And they're always very welcoming. They're always happy to help in return for us hosting. So yeah, they're an excellent organization to have a partnership with.
Okay. So any other questions? We don't have any on. Matthias Lightning is thanking you, but no, I can't see any questions there. The microphones are, I guess they are on. So if anybody has.
Maurizio is shaking hand or
Oh yeah,
raising hand.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well. Thank you for receiving me in this conference. Unfortunately, I forgot that between Italy and Norway there is a 1 hour difference, so I missed the very beginning of the conference. My question comes from the experience. I am the conservator of the Hollandia Museum. Hollandia Museum is the largest private museum in Italy. We exhibit slightly less than 100 flying machines, so airplanes, helicopters, and so on. And one of our major problems, my major problem being the conservator, is how to maintain and make longer the life of the few big airplanes that we have outside, in outside exhibition. I think that problems that were mentioned in this presentation are typical of all the airplanes who lived a very long active life as an airliner, and then make the last flight to the airport or to the museum and become a museum object. Beyond the, let's say, conservation phase, that is, as you mentioned before, taking out all the fuels or the liquids, all the pressures, and stabilizing the big airplane on the floor, let's say, so that it doesn't fly anymore. But what kind of maintenance, preventive maintenance, you, in your experience, you suggest for this type of airplanes? Because I tell you one more thing, and then for your answer, even cleaning it is a problem. Because can be very expensive or very dangerous in other ways. And as you said before, it's no longer possible, even here in Italy, to spray with fire engines the airplane to clean whatever is on top of the wings or the fuselage.
I just absolutely, I recognize what you're saying there, and we were lucky up until now to be in this secure airbase where you're free to do a lot more. But the maintenance that you should do is always going to be a big difference between that and what you are resourced to be able to actually do. So as soon as you see a drip of hydraulic oil, that very same day, within 20 minutes, you need to be wiping that off. If you leave it for a week, it started to bubble your paint. It's but obviously that's not how reality is it? Because you're being asked to deliver many other things. I could spend 50% of my time wiping the nose of the 737, but it's just, I will never be resourced to go and do that. You can try volunteers, but the thing with volunteers is you can't just give them crappy jobs, because it's not what they're there for, and they're not there to make up for a lack of staff resource. You have to give them something good to do. So I think it's unfair to try and just farm that out to volunteers.
Sure.
So before you make these decisions, you have to encourage museum management to really understand the implications of this and to have good costings of it costs this amount to hire 2 lifts. You need 4 people twice a year to do this. But in terms of the scheduling, I think you need to do a proper clean, proper wet clean with just water twice a year. I think there are some safe detergents which you will be allowed to use without the need for regulations and special drainage ditches. And then there's lots of just local cleaning. And we use a lot of just small spray bottles with Vulpex, isopropanol and water mix. And this is a very good degreaser for the hydraulic oil, for example. Yep. But the paint coming off, there's nothing I can do about that. I can't stop it. The patched paint always looks bad. And I know what's going to happen in 20, 25 years. It's going to be so patchy. There'll be comments of why don't we repaint it? So sure. I can't stop it. And you just have to manage its decline rather than conserve it.
I'm very much afraid of the interior because, as you mentioned, the possible developing of mold is a real danger. Unfortunately, the climate in northern Italy is not so much different than Norway. I mean, very cold in winter and very hot in the summer with a lot of humidity, fog, and so on. And given the fact that most of the time the interior of the airplane is free to the public and doors are open, this means that there is a very high difference in temperature between day and night, summer and winter, and so on.
Yes.
And so I'm very much afraid that mold may develop not only on the seats, because this can be easy to see, but in the insulating
totally
envelope at the interior of the airplane. This is something that you don't see. You
Absolutely.
can smell possibly.
Absolutely. There's and I'm hoping that the use of the mixed manifold is going to help. Well, you know, air disturbance is good and mold doesn't like it. And obviously, if you can feed it with humidified air, then I hope to try and avoid some of those problems. But, you know, you have limited resources in terms of money as well. And you have to be inventive, don't you, to try and combat these issues. And you also have to be proportionate. And I think ultimately, if you have aircraft outside, you have to accept they have a lifespan. And Absolutely. You have to decide that there's a cap on the investment for that. And this is one of the reasons, as a conservator, I'm much more relaxed about the use of our 737 and much more open to having it used by all sorts of groups who want to use it to get the most out of it in this 25 years that we'll have it.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments? Not anymore. So just want to thank everybody on behalf of Finnish Aviation Museum Society. We have had very, very good presentations today, 3 of them, and they have been also recorded. So later on, you can also, Maurizio, can watch what we had in the early hours today. So now we'll go towards Christmas time, and from Finland especially, Merry Christmas then for everybody, and let's have a good next year or so.